All right, welcome back. So the last chapter 2, of course, was on the biological matrix that out of which inquiry springs or develops. And of course, chapter 3 is going to be on the cultural matrix of inquiry, because we are, of course, not just biological creatures, but also cultural creatures. So let's get started. I'm going to read a little bit of a longer chunk today, but it's not quite as difficult, this first part, as some other sections that we've looked at. So let's begin. The environment in which human beings live, act, and inquire is not simply physical. It is cultural as well. Problems which induce inquiry grow out of the relations of fellow beings to one another. And the organs for dealing with these relations are not only the eye and ear, but the meanings which have developed in the course of living, together with the ways of forming and transmitting culture, with all its constituents of tools, arts, institutions, traditions, and customary beliefs. So, meaning is a big concept in Dewey that will be coming up in various ways, beginning in this chapter. I don't think we've heard too much about meaning before, because that really, well, I don't know if that exactly only comes in at the cultural level, but that's kind of where we need to account for it more. And one particular meaning that is at the cultural level, symbolic meaning, of course, does come in, as I said, at the cultural level. So meaning is going to become very important. Association of people with other people is going to become very important. So not just thinking about biological processes and biology in relation to the surrounding environment, but people in relation to other people. Because we're talking about human inquiry. Inquiry, I don't know if there could be said to be inquiry in other animals. There is, of course, as Dewey has explained, kind of prototypes or proto-inquiry, proto-science maybe in other animals. But we're going to be, of course, this book is focused on human inquiry, which is to a great extent cultural. Anyway, going on to this first point. He's going to make some various points here. I'm just going to cover this first point in this video. So number 1, to a very large extent, the ways in which human beings respond even to physical conditions are influenced by their cultural environment. So culture influences how we respond to the natural environment. Physical conditions. Light and fire are physical facts, but the occasions in which a human being responds to things as merely physical in purely physical ways are comparatively rare. Such occasions are the act of jumping when a sudden noise is heard, withdrawing the hand when something hot is touched, blinking in the presence of a sudden increase of light, animal like basking in sunshine, etc. So these are kind of maybe we might call instinctive or more genetically determined forms of behavior. So responding to the physical in a physical way, in a more of a brutally physical way, not culturally influenced so much. Such reactions, he says, such reactions are on the biological plane, but the typical cases of human behavior are not represented by such examples. The use of sound in speech and listening to speech, making and enjoying music, the kindling and tending of fire to cook and to keep warm, the production of light to carry on and regulate occupations and social enjoyments. These things are representative of distinctively human activity. So using these physical things for in ways that were not specifically coded into us, that are not part of our genetic inheritance, that are not part of just responses of, kind of immediate responses of matter to matter. So using sound to do something else that's not a kind of mechanical reaction. To indicate the full scope of cultural determination of the conduct of living, one would have to follow the behavior of an individual throughout at least a day, whether that of a day laborer, of a professional man, artist, or scientist, and whether the individual be a growing child or a parent. For the result would show how thoroughly saturated behavior is with conditions and factors that are of cultural origin and import. And this is, of course, a big branch of psychology and anthropology and related sciences, related fields, is finding out all the different ways that behavior can be culturally influenced, how people do things differently in different cultures. Of distinctively human behavior, it may be said that the strictly physical environment is so incorporated in a cultural environment that our interactions with the former, the problems that arise with reference to it, and our ways of dealing with these problems are profoundly affected by incorporation of the physical environment in the cultural. So how we deal with the physical environment is profoundly affected by how it is incorporated into our cultural environment. Man, as Aristotle remarked, is a social animal. And of course, this is kind of the old-fashioned language. Man means just human beings. Human beings are social animals would be maybe a better way to say it today, but don't pay too much mind to the old-fashioned language. The fact introduces him into situations and originates problems and ways of solving them that have no precedent upon the organic biological level. Talking about human beings here, not Aristotle. So the fact that we are social animals, that we're born into societies, that we need societies to exist and to become fully human, gives us new kinds of problems. For man is social in another sense than the bee and ant, since his activities are encompassed in an environment that is culturally transmitted. So we transmit our culture in a way that animals don't seem to. I mean, there's some evidence for culturally transmitted behavior in some other animals. I don't know necessarily bees and ants, but other kinds of animals, other primates, and maybe even other non-primate animals. But really, to a huge extent, a much more extensive degree, activities are culturally transmitted in humans, so that what man does and how he acts is determined not by organic structure and physical heredity alone, but by the influence of cultural heredity embedded in traditions, institutions, customs, and the purposes and beliefs they both carry and inspire. And again, maybe today we would want to draw less of a line between human and non-human animals in this regard, but definitely cultural transmission, cultural heritage, cultural influence is much more extensive in humans. Anyway, going on. Even the neuromuscular structures of individuals are modified through the influence of the cultural environment upon the activities performed. The acquisition and understanding of language with proficiency in the arts that are foreign to other animals than men represent an incorporation within the physical structure of human beings of the effects of cultural conditions and interpenetration so profound that resulting activities are as direct and seemingly natural as are the first reactions of an infant. So our physical beings, our physical biological beings are profoundly impacted by our incorporation in cultural environments, in our incorporation in societies, so that our cultural reactions become as immediate as he says, the first reactions of an infant, or of the instinctive reactions of a lower animal. To speak, to read, to exercise any art, industrial, fine, or political, are instances of modifications wrought within the biological organism by the cultural environment. So, of course, these are all cultural activities performed by biological creatures who have had their biologies impacted, changed, modified by culture. Going on. This modification of organic behavior in and by the cultural environment accounts for, or rather is, the transformation of purely organic behavior into behavior marked by intellectual properties with which the present discussion is concerned. So intellectual properties. So these are kind of a special cultural property. Intellectual, right? So talking about intellectual properties, intellectual operations. Well, there's another important word, and words like intellectual and intelligence have lots of other meanings. Dewey is going to give us a particular meaning, maybe a refinement of our popular sense of what intellectual is. So you'll have to we'll grasp that as we go. So yeah, don't take intellectual. Be careful how you, for now, take the term intellectual. Intellectual operations are foreshadowed in behavior of the biological kind, and the latter prepares the way for the former. So just like inquiry, logic are prepared for by biology, so intellectual operations is a part of that, so logical operations. But to foreshadow is not to exemplify, and to prepare is not to fulfill. So they're not the same things. Any theory that rests upon a naturalistic postulate must face the problem of the extraordinary differences that mark off the activities and achievements of human beings from those of other biological forms. And we saw in the last chapter that this is not necessarily a problem that non-naturalistic perspectives or non-naturalistic philosophies face, but there are, I think, good reasons to try to be a naturalist, and so this is one of the challenges, is showing how human beings are continuous with other life forms, but are also different and unique. And that's always maybe a tricky line to walk. It is these differences of human beings from other biological forms, that have led to the idea that man is completely separate from other animals by properties that come from a non-natural source. So non-naturalism, supernaturalism. But the conception to be developed in the present chapter is that the development of language, in its widest sense, out of prior biological activities is, in its connection with wider cultural forces, the key to this transformation. So language, very important. The key to the transformation, to the cultural transformation of human beings. The problem, so viewed, is not the problem of the transition of organic behavior into something wholly discontinuous with it, as is the case when, for example, reason, intuition, and the a priori are appealed to for explanation of the difference. So there is not a a wholly discontinuous thing. I couldn't think of how to begin with wholly, but it's not a entirely discontinuous break between human beings and animals. So that's not the problem we need to figure out. But What is the problem? It is a special form of the general problem of continuity of change and the emergence of new modes of activity, the problem of development at any level. So again, Dewey doesn't see things in big breaks with gaps that we could explain through supernatural means, but developmentally, evolutionarily, in the really kind of strict Darwinian sense, where there's these gradual changes, and maybe bigger or smaller changes, but there's a continuity. And so that gives you the explanatory challenge of explaining difference through continuity. Viewing the problem from this angle, its constituents may be reduced to two certain heads, three of which will be noted. So headings or topic headings or something. Organic behavior is centered in. So I just want to be clear about what these are. So the first one coming up is a kind of singular versus general heading. So organic behavior is centered in particular organisms. This statement applies to inferring and reasoning as existential activities. But if inferences made and conclusions reached are to be valid, the subject matter dealt with and the operations employed must be such as to yield identical results for all who infer and reason. So inference, inquiry, at least reasoning. I mean, inquiry can be a group endeavor, and so can reasoning. But, so inferring and reasoning may also be centered in particular individuals, right? I can infer alone in my office. I can reason. But whatever conclusions I reach, if they are valid conclusions, need to be reachable through the same method by other people. If the same evidence leads different persons to different conclusions, then either the evidence is only speciously the same, so not really the same, or one conclusion or both is wrong. So if two people look at the same evidence and reach different conclusions, well, either they're not really looking at the same evidence, or one or both of their conclusions are wrong. And it doesn't mean that if they both reach the same conclusion, that it's definitely correct, but at least there's a better chance of it being correct than if they reach different conclusions. The special constitution of an individual organism which plays such a role in biological behavior is so irrelevant in controlled inquiry that it has to be discounted and mastered. So we have to figure out ways of accounting for and discounting the differences among different people when we're looking at processes of reasoning. And this will be maybe offensive or sound kind of not politically correct to some people, but this is the idea that we're going to be exploring, is that for your conclusions to be considered sound, I have to be able to reach them in a similar way, and it can't rely the conclusions can't rely on some special thing about you, some special quality of you. I also have to be able to do that same thing. Otherwise, it's just knowable by one distinctive person, and that's not going to be able to count as scientific knowledge. It may be interesting and good in some other way, but we can't count it as valid scientific knowledge if it's only knowable through your special abilities, or my special abilities, or whoever. Okay, so going on to the next heading, he's beginning kind of his next topic here. So we had singular versus general, kind of the unique individual versus kind of what can be done by any individual. This next one is kind of similar and maybe overlaps in some way. but subjective versus objective. So let's get into that. Another phase of the problem is brought out by the part played in human judgments by emotion and desire. These personal traits cook the evidence and determine the result that is reached. So this is interesting. So emotions, desire, they cook the evidence. They kind of maybe bias the evidence, determine the results that will be reached. That is, upon the level of organic factors, which are the actively determining forces in the types of cases just mentioned. I think maybe in the case of emotion and desire, I sometimes get confused by when he's referring to things that he talked about before, but he's not always clear about referring to what he is referring to. Anyway, upon the level of organic factors, the individual with his individual peculiarities, whether native or acquired, is an active participant in producing ideas and beliefs. And yet, the latter are logically grounded only when such peculiarities are deliberately precluded from taking effect. So let's go back a little bit. I guess organic factors like emotion and desire. The individual with his individual peculiarities is an active participant in producing ideas and beliefs. Of course, an individual is an active participant in maybe producing his own beliefs. Not the only participant. That's a cultural thing as well. But the latter, so the ideas and beliefs, are logically grounded only when the peculiarities of individuals are precluded from affecting those final products, I think is what we were saying. Those ideas, those beliefs. So an emotion and desire are important in maybe driving us to produce ideas and beliefs, but they are logically grounded. Those ideas and beliefs are logically grounded only when they are not, only when the peculiarities of individual emotion and desire are kind of taken out of that. So, and that's very similar to what we just talked about. So this point restates what was said in connection with the first point, but it indicates another phase of the matter. If, using accepted terminology, we say that the first difference is that between the singular and the general, the present point may be formulated as the difference between the subjective and the objective. To be intellectually objective is to discount and eliminate merely personal factors in the operations by which a conclusion is reached. So, objective, you're discounting, you're trying to eliminate purely personal, emotional concerns, things like that, in performing the operations by which a conclusion is to be reached. So that's kind of trying to eliminate the subjective factor. Not that you need to do this everywhere, but for something to be logically grounded, for something to be an instance of scientific knowing, of a warranted assertion, then this needs to be the case. All right, and then I think the third heading here has to do with temporality. So let's go on to that to kind of finish up this first point that Dewey makes in this chapter. Organic behavior is a strictly temporal affair, but when behavior is intellectually formulated in respect both to general ways of behavior and the special environing conditions in which they operate. Let me look at that again. So when behavior is intellectually formulated in respect to both the general ways of behavior and the special environing conditions in which those general ways of behavior operate, propositions result. So when you intellectually formulate behavior, the result is propositions, and the terms of a proposition do not sustain a temporal relation to one another. So for now, you can think of a proposition as a kind of like subject-predicate sort of thing. So in that case, you might have these two terms, the subject and the predicate, that you're relating to each other, but it's not a temporal relation. They don't have a temporal relation to one another. They have a relation, but it's not temporal. So it was a temporal event when someone landed on Robinson Crusoe's island. It was a temporal event when Crusoe found the footprint on the sand. It was a temporal event when Crusoe inferred the presence of a possibly dangerous stranger. But while the proposition was about something temporal, and I think here the proposition is, that there is a stranger on the island, or there is a dangerous stranger on the island, or a dangerous stranger is on the island. But while the proposition was about something temporal, the relation of the observed facts as evidential to the inference drawn from it is non-temporal. So the fact of there being a stranger on the island is non-temporal, even though, of course, arriving at that fact, that inference is temporal, takes place in time. The same holds of every logical relation in and of propositions. So logical relations are not temporal relations. They are arrived at in temporal ways. They can be derived from temporal things. But propositions, for example, a scientific law, will be one example that we'll be eventually discussing. A scientific law does not involve temporal relations in the proposition itself. It's not, the parts of the proposition are not temporal. This can be tricky to understand, and there will be long sections on this about this later. But it's an important distinction to kind of hold in your head for now, is that logical relations are not temporal relations, even though they have all kinds of temporal background to them. So this is kind of the last paragraph that I'm going to mention here. In the following discussion, it is maintained that the solution of the problem just stated in some of its phases is intimately and directly connected with cultural subject matter. Transformation from organic behavior to intellectual behavior, marked by logical properties, is a product of the fact that individuals live in a cultural environment. So a summary of what we've just talked about. Such living compels them to assume in their behavior the standpoint of customs, beliefs, institutions, meanings, and projects which are at least relatively general and objective. So we take on these cultural things, these cultural customs, beliefs, institutions, meanings, projects, which are about everyone to some extent, not about our, not specifically directed to or about our, or dependent on our individual peculiarities or emotions or desires, but they are relatively general and objective. Okay, and I'm going to stop here and we'll continue with number 2 in the next video.